Hello, I wanted to welcome you to the Food and Nutrition and Health and Wellbeing lecture. This is the Medical Resident Fellowship lecture for the Fellowship in Lifestyle Medicine. My name is Dr. Rachel Pojednik. I'm an assistant professor of nutrition at the Simmons College in Boston, Massachusetts. I put this program together with Mary Kennedy, who is one of the rotation preceptors, who also has a master's degree in nutrition from Tufts University. So I wanted to start to talk to you today about nutrition intervention specifically. We're going to be referring to research throughout this lecture, and I just wanted to make sure that we understood exactly what we're talking about with regard to nutrition interventions. So we've got several types of studies that are done in nutrition, specifically thinking about the difference between a case report, which you may see often in the medical literature, and all the way out to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We use these in different ways in nutrition because it is such an applied science. So with regard to systematic reviews, randomized control trials, and quasi-experiments, we tend to think about those as the experimental arm of nutrition interventions. So specifically, the randomized control trial has always sort of been thought of as the gold standard for nutrition research, where you randomly select a group of patients to either receive a treatment or a food, another to receive a placebo or perhaps a different food or diet, and then you compare the clinical outcomes of each. In reality, you typically end up more with a quasi-experiment setup in nutrition where subjects are non-randomly assigned. And typically this happens because of location. For example, if you're doing a school-based study, one school would be your treatment group and one school would be your experiment or your placebo group or your non-experimental group. But it's not that individual patients are assigned, or in this case students are assigned to receive a treatment or placebo, but perhaps by their location. These get put together in systematic reviews and meta-analyses where you look at several studies in aggregate and you reevaluate their data by putting them all together. This happens a fair amount in nutrition, and it's actually a really important part of nutrition, although there are certainly some flaws with the analyses, that we want to start thinking about nutrition specifically as a consensus. And this is something that we'll talk about a lot through this lecture, is that we often see in nutrition these sort of pop culture flash in the pan studies that come out. One day coffee is great for you, the next day it's killing you, one day you should be on a high fat diet, one day on a low fat diet. And so what we really like to think about with nutrition is looking at these systematic reviews and meta-analyses and thinking about the aggregation of the data and the consensus that we can come to with regard to the data. We get a lot of our data in nutrition in observational studies as well. So we think about these as the sort of epidemiologic studies, and you probably have seen these, the Nurses' Health Study, the Framingham Study, other large cohort studies, where we're following a group of people to track risk factors and outcomes over time. And then you can get a little bit further as a case control study. So we look at histories of people that have developed a certain condition, and we can compare the diets that they say that they had. This is challenging because, and this is similar to many of these observational studies, is that we have to use food frequency questionnaires to sort of get at what people are eating. And we're finding in the literature more and more that, not surprisingly, people fib a little bit or perhaps even forget about what they typically tend to eat. And so these data can be skewed a little bit based on just recall bias. Cross-sectional surveys we look at a lot with regard to nutrition, and you'll see these a lot, particularly in pop culture, where we say, if something is increasing, then an outcome is increasing. So for example, a sort of classic nutrition study is the more fat that you eat, and this comes up in the Ancel Keys 7-country study. The more fat that you eat, the more likely you are to develop cardiovascular disease. These are interesting for nutrition in that they give us a starting point to think about with regard to designing a randomized controlled trial or even a quasi-experiment to dig a little bit deeper, because we do know when we're finding out every single day that individual responses to food and to nutrition are paramount, and we can find wide variations person to person. But cross-sectional surveys and studies give us a really interesting peek at what might be going on with regard to specific nutrients and their clinical outcomes. Case reports you'll often see in the medical literature where you'll have a detailed history of a small number of individual cases or perhaps even one case of something that's sort of interesting. This tends to not play such an important role in the nutrition literature, although it can give you a starting point similar to a cross-sectional survey. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the science behind nutrition. We're going to go into the macro and micronutrients, specifically the two components of foods that provide energy. Those are the macronutrients, carbohydrates, abbreviated CHO, fat, and the different kinds of fats, and then proteins. And then also the micronutrients, so vitamins, minerals, and water. We're also going to take a little dip into phytochemicals as well. So carbohydrates. It's critical that your body gets carbohydrates. These are the glucose-providing nutrients in your diet. We get caught up a lot. You'll hear a lot in the sort of common lexicon of, high carb or a low carb diet. We tend to think in nutrition that you want, and we'll get into these with the dietary guidelines, is that you want somewhere between 40 and 65% of your diet to be coming from carbohydrates, in that they provide that initial energy source, namely glucose, for your body to function. We get into a little bit more detail with regard to whole grains versus refined grains, and this is where we start to see the differences in clinical outcomes, particularly with the progression of certain diseases that we know are linked to diet, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, particularly with regard to glucose, and then even some cancers, and perhaps even some other diseases of the brain, like dementia and Alzheimer's. So with regard to whole grains versus refined grains, this is a really important differentiation. And actually, if you look at a study that just was released in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, put out by Sue Roberts' group at Tufts USDA, HNRCA, they actually compared a diet of rich in whole grains and the exact same amount of refined grains, and they found a tremendous amount of difference with regard to disease development as well as metabolism. They found that a diet rich in whole grains actually increases metabolism by approximately 50 calories per day, and also about 50 calories from those whole grains, which you'll see why in just a minute. Whole grains were sequestered in the stool, and so essentially were eliminated. So by increasing your whole grains, you almost found 100 calories in your diet that were just not metabolized. So it's really important with regard to weight and then also the downstream effects in diseases such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes, swapping out those whole grains for refined grains. So whole grains are going to contain, with regard to our grains that we are looking at here on the right side of the screen, whole grains are going to contain the bran, the endosperm, and the germ of the grain. So the bran is going to be that outer shell that's going to protect the seed, essentially, which is most grains we would consider a version of a seed. The outer cell is going to contain fiber, which we'll get into a lot in the next couple of slides. Several of the B vitamins. You don't really tend to think of whole grains as rich in B vitamins, but they are, particularly whole grains, as well as some trace minerals. The endosperm is where those carbohydrates lie, so this is going to be providing energy as that grain starts to grow. This is where we find most of the carbohydrates, namely glucose. And then the germ is actually a fat-based component of the grain, and that's going to provide nourishment for the seed. This is going to contain most of the antioxidants. There's a significant amount of vitamin E, which is why when we think about eating whole grains, you're also getting the vitamin E as an antioxidant, and B vitamins are also in the germ. So you can see that the difference here when you have a whole grain is you've got this fibrous outer shell, you've got this carbohydrate component, and then you've also got this fat globule that's going to contain the fat-soluble vitamins. With regard to processed or refined grains, these are only going to contain the endosperm, so you're only going to get that carbohydrate component. You're not going to get the germ, and you're not going to get the bran. So these are foods like white rice, white bread, or white pasta, and this is compared to the whole grain versions, which would be something like brown rice, whole wheat bread with that sort of like nutty, seedy exterior, and pearled barley. And we want at least half of your daily grain choices to be this high fiber, high nutrient dense whole grain. So this leads us into sugar, and we all are sort of becoming more and more aware of the dangers of sugar in our diet, and we know that it's everywhere. So when we think about sugar and you think about, some sugars are perhaps better than other sugars, it's actually not true. Your body physiologically sees glucose and then fructose very, very similarly, regardless of the source. Glucose is going to be metabolized differently than fructose. However, the source doesn't really matter with regard to the way that your body picks it up. So when we're thinking about the different sugar sources, agave nectar, this one is so hot right now. Everybody thinks that if they sub out their sugar for agave nectar, that they're doing something wonderful. Yes, agave nectar is significantly more sweet than table sugar. However, it's pretty much 100% fructose. So when we're thinking about things like sugar-sweetened beverages that have the high fructose corn syrup in it, swapping it out for agave nectar really isn't doing anything for your body. Brown rice syrup, high fructose corn syrup, dextrose, evaporated cane juice, glucose, lactose, honey, molasses, and sucrose are all seen by your body almost the same with different variations of glucose and fructose. Again, your glucose is going to be metabolized slightly different from fructose, which is going to be metabolized mostly in your liver. So there is some consideration there with regard to increasing the amounts of fructose in the diet. However, finding the fructose from sources that are whole foods like fruit is going to provide that extra fibrous layer, which is going to be significantly beneficial. When we think about sugar, this is simply a carbohydrate with only energy. There typically are no nutrients. And people, this is a comparison of honey versus regular sugar. We tend to think that if you swap honey out, that you're sort of winning a little moral victory. You actually are not. The calories are pretty comparable for the serving size. There's a teeny, 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 tiny bit of protein and perhaps some trace minerals that are in honey, but not enough to have clinical significance. We do know, however, that added sugars in the diets of the U.S. population is incredibly high. So when we look at the top left chart here, the added sugars this is from NHANES data in 2005 and 2006, so it's probably even worse today, is that the added sugars are coming from things like soda and energy drinks and sports drinks. So things like Gatorade are providing a tremendous amount of sugar, especially in our kids' diets. Grain-based desserts, fruit drinks, dairy desserts, all other food categories. And then you look at things like candy, ready-to-eat cereals, sugars and honey that's added, teas that are sweetened, and then some yeast breads. You'll notice that in the labels of most breads, sugar is high on the label. So when you look at the sources of calories, and this is where things start to get a little bit scary, is that the number one source of calories for Americans ages 2 and older are these sources that are so high in sugar. So things like grain-based desserts, that's where we get most of our calories across the lifespan. So ages 2 years old up to 19 plus. Yeast breads, soda and energy drinks are right up there, and alcoholic beverages, things like pizza and pasta dishes are also very high in sugars and carbohydrates. 4 out of the 5 top sources of calories are the 3 top foods with added sugar. So we know we're eating the wrong things. This leads me to fiber, which is sort of a derivative of carbohydrates. We have soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber is going to be found in things like apples, things like pectin. And what's going to happen is that your body is going to break the soluble fiber down, and it's going to form sort of a thick paste in your gut. And that thick paste is going to slow absorption of other nutrients and also provide a barrier between the food and the endothelium in your gut. So that way you have a protective layer. Insoluble fiber, you do not have the enzymes to digest it. However, the gut microbiome does. And so the insoluble fiber is going to provide a really critical food source for the healthy microbiome in your gut. So we call this prebiotics. Fiber is one of your most important prebiotics. Fiber is also very filling. So when you eat a fibrous food like lentils or beans or the skin around an apple, that can be very satiating. Again, as I mentioned, it's going to feed the bacteria in your gut. It's also going to reduce cholesterol. So I have a slide on this in just a second to show you how that works. The most fiber that you're going to find is fruits, veggies, nuts, and whole grains. That's where fiber comes from. Interestingly, if you ask the general population where fiber comes from, most people will say that they think that there's fiber in steak. There's actually no fiber in steak. You need that plant cell to provide the fiber in your diet. So the next category of macronutrient is a protein. We typically think to associate proteins with animal products. So here we've got an egg, lean chicken, some salmon, and some cheese. But you can get a significant amount of protein from plant-based product as well. Interestingly, if you look at whole wheat pasta, as opposed to some of these sort of gluten-free pastas that are not using these high-protein whole grains, you'll notice that there's a significant decrease in the protein content of many of these grain-based products because we're moving away from whole grain. And whole grain does have a pretty good amount of of protein. So why do you need protein? Protein is going to break into amino acids. There are 21 total, 9 are essential. In nutrition, when we talk about essential nutrients, we're talking about nutrients that you must eat because your body cannot make them. These are used in your body as building blocks for tissues, and I like to call them other bits and pieces, so things like enzymes and signaling molecules. They're critical for muscle building and maintenance, which becomes even more crucial as you age. They're important for enzymes, which are going to be responsible for metabolic reactions. They're very important for signaling molecules to crosstalk between organs in your body. And they're also becoming more and more important, we think, for satiety, so that feeling of fullness, and then potentially, because of that increased feeling of fullness, an increase in weight loss. And I just like to put here some protein sources. We tend to think, again, as proteins from meat and dairy products specifically. But if you look at some of these grams of protein, you'll find that there are significant sources of protein in things in legumes such as peas and lentils, leafy greens such as spinach, and some nuts and seeds like sunflower seeds. So you can get much of your requirement by having several sources of proteins throughout the day. So the dietary guidelines, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next couple of slides, state that we want somewhere between 0.8 and 1.0 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for protein. So this is about 60 to 75 grams per day, or 10 to 35% of your total calories. This is actually really hard to talk to your patients about because nobody really knows what 60 to 75 grams of protein is unless you're really, really watching labels, and even then, it's really challenging to keep track of it all. So you'll see some strategies on how to overcome this in the next couple of slides. So some sources that you can find, again, are meat, fish, legumes. Tofu is a vegetarian version. Eggs, nuts, seeds, milk, and dairy. There's also a significant amount, as I mentioned, in grains and veggies. Complete proteins are going to contain all 9 essential amino acids. You get these mostly from animal products like eggs, meat, fish, and dairy. Some incomplete proteins are going to contain some or most essential amino acids, sources like tofu, beans, or vegetables. And as long as you're mixing and matching your fruits and vegetables throughout the day, you won't have a problem. The nutrition world used to get a little bit bonkers about matching the right food. So we always used to say, if you have beans and rice, you'll get a complete protein. If you eat a rich diet with many different fruits and vegetables throughout the day, you'll cover it, you'll be fine. So just here are the amino acids, the essential versus non-essential. I'm not going to get into specifically which one does what, but just it's important to know that these amino acids are going to be critical for both anabolism and catabolism of certain tissue proteins, amination and excretion pathways, creating neurotransmitters and plasma proteins. And you're going to get most of these proteins from your diet. The last macronutrient, which means that this is the last nutrient that's going to provide energy. So carbohydrates, protein, and fat can all provide energy in your body. Fat is going to be a really important fuel reserve. It's also critical for cellular membrane components and inflammatory signaling, as well as nerve cell health, particularly the myelin in a nerve cell. When you think about the accumulation of fat, we're thinking about the adipocytes. These are really critical for body temperature regulation, for padding if you fall. And it's always sort of funny to bring that up, but when you think about an older cohort of patients, if they were to fall, which we know that they're apt to do, if they've got a little bit of extra padding around those bones, it can actually decrease their risk of fracture. And then lastly, you just sort of critically need it when you're eating foods together, because there are these essential fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K that need fat in order to be absorbed through the intestine. So the recommendations that the dietary guidelines say is somewhere between 20 and 30% total calories. I like to point this out because there's sort of been a historical myth that the recommendations for fat has been very low for a long time, and that's not actually true. When we say a low-fat diet, we're just saying that we want you to get foods from sort of natural sources, low in saturated fat, not so much total fat. So we actually do see a lot of health benefit from eating unsaturated fats from sources like fish or avocado. And we want that to be somewhere between 20 and 30% of your total calories. So when we're thinking about a low-fat diet, it's really, if you think about it more like a low-saturated fat diet, that's really what we're thinking about. But the total fat, if you get it from oils and from natural sources like avocado or fish, that's actually great. You want to consume less than 10% of your calories from saturated fat, so just keeping an eye on that and keeping it limited. Replacing solid fats with oils whenever possible. Limiting foods with trans fat. So trans fat is this man-made molecule that we essentially flipped a cis bond to a trans bond so that these fats stacked much better, which were used for things like peanut butter and other processed foods. And that processed food then increased its shelf life and didn't have that separation. Like when you have peanut butter, if you buy the natural peanut butter, you get that oil layer on the top. If you have trans fat, which has actually been replaced with another kind of fat that we're not so sure about, it's better to just sort of buy the peanut butter that separates a little bit. You want to eat less than 300 milligrams per day of cholesterol. This isn't particularly, and this was kind of controversial in the last dietary guidelines. You just want to just be careful, particularly if you're already at risk for cardiovascular disease, reducing cholesterol from the diet. However, we're finding that it doesn't seem to be increasing risk so much with more cholesterol, but the literature is still a little bit wishy-washy on if decreasing your cholesterol helps. So it's just good to keep an eye on it. And then lastly, reducing your intake of calories from solid fats. The solid fats at room temperature tend to be saturated fats. So if you think about a steak, that marbling on the edge, that thick layer of fat, that's a saturated fat, and that's going to stay fat at room temperature. Whereas if you think of an oil like an olive oil or a coconut oil or a sunflower oil, safflower oil, that will be liquid at room temperature. So you want to encourage the use of those. One thing that I like to say, and this is just sort of a tip, is people are always like, oh, should I use coconut oil or should I use butter or should I use whatever? The thing is that the calories from all of these fats are the same. So it's going to be 9 calories per gram of fat. And particularly when you're thinking about cooking with these fats or using them, what I like to tell people is just use the fat that makes sense for what you're doing. So if you're making a salad, obviously using butter is not going to work. But if you're sauteing some, you want to use olive oil, obviously, for something like that. If you're sauteing something at high temperatures, which is fine to do, using something like a coconut oil or another type of oil that has a high smoke point is really going to be better for 2 reasons. 1, you won't burn your food, and 2, you won't smoke up the kitchen. It's just kind of finding the right fat that's correct for the tool that you're trying to use it for. So this is the slide that I alluded to earlier about the interaction of fiber and cholesterol. So I really love to show this slide because it shows you how fiber specifically is going to reduce your cholesterol load, which is why we recommend a high fiber diet. So as you know, the liver is going to create, through a process, is going to create bile salts and bile acids that is actually going to be excreted into the intestines when you eat a meal, right? So if you eat a meal and you are in the process of digestion, you're going to secrete this bile to emulsify the food that you've just eaten. And so fiber naturally binds to that bile salt and bile acid and takes it straight to excretion. So because you have sort of secreted this extra bile out into your system. It's bound to the fiber. Your body then has to take cholesterol from your system in order to recreate bile, because one of the components of bile salts in bile is cholesterol. So if you eat something like a cheeseburger, which has significant cholesterol, or something like eggs or lobster, you can actually overcome that a little bit if you eat a fibrous diet along with it, because you are excreting that bile, having to replace it from your dietary cholesterol, thus taking it out of your circulation. So this is why it's really important. And Cheerios sort of latched onto this a long time ago, which is why they say that the Cheerios zaps the cholesterols out of your bloodstream. It actually does. It's going to bind it via bile and excrete it. So then we move on to the micronutrients. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you want more information about micronutrients, I highly recommend taking a straight up nutrition, intro to nutrition course, and they go over all of the nutrients and exactly what they do. But the micronutrients, the important thing is that these are the vitamins and minerals that are not going to provide energy. However, they are important as coenzymes and cofactors. So you're going to see the vitamins and minerals mostly from plants. So whole grains, nuts, fruits, and vegetables are going to be significantly high in vitamins. You will see some minerals from meat products like zinc and magnesium. These are important components of enzymes, particularly the B vitamins are going to be really important for enzymes and for cofactors. The hormones, the vitamin D, again, is a cholesterol derivative. So there's another way that you can use the cholesterol in your system. And that's going to be an important hormone and prohormone. Blood cells are going to use iron. The mineralization of bone is going to be heavily reliant on calcium, as is the contraction of muscle. And then lastly, hydration, as well as most of the processes in our body are going to rely on a sodium-potassium pump. So vitamins and minerals, just to recap again, are essential. They do not provide energy. And the important thing about vitamins and minerals to know is that you can get nutrition deficiency diseases if you don't get enough. And you'll probably see some of these in the clinic, particularly when we're looking at, we are seeing a phenomenon right now where we see obese patients, overweight or obese patients that are malnourished because they're simply not getting a nutrient-dense diet. So all these diseases that we haven't seen in quite some time, we're actually seeing again things like rickets, osteoporosis is sort of prevalent, anemia, night blindness, and it's an increase in neural tube defects as people start to move away from these fortified foods that have folate in them, particularly one of the B vitamins. So it's really important as you find patients that you might think have some sort of malnourishment to double check and make sure that their vitamins and minerals are on point and that they're not at risk for nutrition deficiency diseases. Two vitamins that I like to highlight are particularly vitamin D, because we know that the majority of people are actually vitamin D deficient. Again, vitamin D, if you took a look at the top left there, is a cholesterol derivative. We say and know that if you have UVB rays hitting your skin, that's going to essentially cause a cascade, causing the breakup of the 7-dehydrocholesterol ring, which turns to pre-vitamin D3 to D3, and then it goes through the process between your liver and your kidneys to convert into the active form, which is 1-alpha 25-hydroxyvitamin D3, which is going to do all kinds of things like increase calcium, increase bone mineralization, has a really important role in immune cells, perhaps even with cancer. The problem is here for twofold is, one, if you are not living in an area where you have the right angle of UVB light, or that UVB light is low. So for example, if you're in New England in the winter, anytime between about October to April, you have very diminished UVB rays. And so I had a professor at Tufts that used to love to say, you can dance naked in the street in Boston on a bluebird day in December and you won't make an ounce of vitamin D, which means that you need to get that vitamin D from your diet, which is actually challenging to do, particularly if you don't eat a lot of dairy. So it's really important to maintain that vitamin D either by diet or potentially with a vitamin D supplement. And this is one of the 2 supplements that I recommend for people, particularly in northern climates in the winter, because it is challenging to get vitamin D from your diet. The other that I recommend is vitamin B12, and this is particularly important for two populations. One are people that are following a vegetarian or a vegan diet, particularly a vegan diet. B12 we know comes from animal-based products. So if you're not eating animal-based foods, even if you're sort of a vegetarian that only eats a little bit of dairy, you may be at risk for vitamin B12 deficiencies, which can in early stages lead to anemia, but in later stages, especially if it's not caught, and it can be masked if you have enough folate, because you won't notice that anemia right away. You can see cognitive declines later on in life because you're not having enough of the stimulation of nerve cells. And this doesn't tend to show up until older age, so you really have to pay attention to it. If somebody is on a vegan diet, definitely recommend a B12 supplement. Lastly, just a quick note on phytochemicals. These come up a lot, particularly in popular culture right now. Thinking about all of these fortified and functional foods that we have. So, you can go to the grocery store and everything has, some sort of chemical or another in it that's going to fight aging or fight cancer or promote gut health or whatever. And a lot of these are the phytochemicals that we see from mostly plant foods. And so this is just a gigantic chart of all of these phytochemicals that we know to be in food, in plant food particularly. And so it's just really important to know that this literature is in its infancy right now. Very, very few studies have done controlled trials on supplementation. And so when we're thinking about much of this food that is enhanced or fortified with some of these chemicals, they are just that, and we're not 100% sure what all of them do yet. We know that many of them do act as antioxidants or potentially have a positive role, but really we're not 100% certain what they're all doing yet. So you just need to be really careful if your patients come to you with some products that have a lot of these things in them, that the hype is a little bit more than what we know right now. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, these are phytochemicals, so they come from plant foods. I would recommend just eating the plant because you get all of these phytochemicals plus the minerals and the vitamins that go along with it, plus the carbohydrates or the fiber. So if you had a fortified or a supplement of orange extract or something like that, I would just recommend to your patients that they eat the orange. They get the vitamin C, they get all the phytochemicals that are in that, they get the fiber, and they get the carbohydrates. That way, and this is sort of something that I sort of harp on all the time, is if you eat real food, you're going to get all of these things naturally and in an amount that your body is prepared to manage and to handle. Lastly, we think about water. So this is not a micro or a macronutrient, but it is essential to life. Critically important, first and foremost, to hydration and osmotic pressure. Really important for temperature regulation, sweating, or increased temperature with hydration, lubrication and cushion for joints. It's going to protect your spinal cord and other sensitive organs and tissues. And also, this is sort of our body's natural detox, right? So when we're thinking about ridding the body of waste through urination, perspiration, and bowel movements, using water, our liver, and our kidneys, this is the way our body detoxes. It's sort of a buzzword now, these sort of cleanse and detox diets, where people are just really bonkers about wanting to make sure that their body is clean. Your body is clean as long as your liver and your kidneys are working and you're drinking enough water. The Institute of Medicine recommends that women have at least 2.7 liters, men have at least 3.7 liters. There's really no upper limit, although you can, particularly in athletic events, they're noticing more and more overhydration problems, which leads to imbalances in sodium, particularly, which can lead to cardiovascular problems or even potential muscle problems. So drinking water and eating high water content foods is important, and then just making sure that you're balancing out those electrolytes if you're participating in something like a marathon. So then we come to the dietary guidelines. What do we know and how do we know it with regard to diet? So we're going to spend a few minutes understanding the dietary guidelines for Americans, introducing the process of creating the 2010 and the 2015 dietary guidelines, which are the most recent ones, the update on the 2015 dietary guidelines, Then we're going to take a quick dive into food labels, the governing bodies of food labels, and how to read and use them. So what are the dietary guidelines? So these are a policy document that provides advice for making food choices to promote good health, advocate a healthy weight, and help prevent diseases. They're charged for ages 2 and older. The nutrition requirements for infants are different than 2 and older when you're starting to eat solid foods. The aims of the dietary guidelines are to promote health, prevent chronic disease, and help people reach and maintain a healthy weight. I think it's important to note here that this is a policy document that's made for providers and it's made for policy for individuals that are involved in policy. There are some tools that are for the general public, but typically this is for practitioners to guide us onto how to guide our patients and our clients. The guidelines form the basis of the federal nutrition policies, education, outreach, and food assistance programs, so things like SNAP, WIC, and the school breakfast and lunch programs. They're going to help guide local, state, and national health promotion and disease prevention initiatives. And they're also going to inform various organizations and industries how to develop products, how to market them, and potentially how to label them. So the 2015 dietary guidelines came out about a year and a half ago. They actually were released in 2016. They were a little bit late because they were somewhat controversial. The idea here is and these say very, very simple, very purposefully that they're very simple, is to follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. So the idea here is that all food and beverage choices matter and that you want to choose a healthy eating pattern at an appropriate calorie level to help achieve and maintain a healthy body weight, support nutrient adequacy, and reduce the risk of chronic disease. We want to focus on variety, nutrient density, and amount. So nutrient density, I think specifically, is the important element here, where we're thinking about how many nutrients can we get for our calorie buck. So we want a high nutrient dense food that's potentially low in calories, that's satiating and filling, things like fruits and vegetables. So we want to meet nutrient needs within calorie limits. We want to choose a variety of nutrient-dense foods across and within all food groups in recommended amounts. We want to limit calories from added sugars and saturated fats, as I mentioned before, and reduce sodium intakes, particularly for people that are at risk for hypertension. You want to consume an eating pattern low in added sugars, saturated fats, and sodium, cutting back on foods and beverages higher in these components to amounts that fit within the healthy eating patterns is going to be important. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the lecture. So the key recommendations are to eat a healthy eating pattern, consuming a healthy eating pattern that accounts for all foods and beverages within an appropriate calorie level. So these are dark green, red and orange, vegetables, legumes and beans, fruits, particularly whole fruits, grains, at least half which are whole, fat-free or low-fat dairy, although that is changing a little bit, where we're thinking more about full fat or regular fat dairy because it tends to actually be a little bit more nutrient dense, that removing of the fat can reduce some of the other nutrients that are naturally found in these dairy products. So as long as it's within a calorie limit, the guidelines are sort of changing that full fat dairy is actually okay, again, within those calorie limits. A variety of protein foods, including seafood, lean meats, poultry, eggs, legumes, which we know are high in protein, nuts, seeds, and soy, and then oils for those healthy unsaturated fats. The healthy eating pattern is going to limit saturated fat and trans fat, which is that swapped man-made fat, added sugars, and sodium. This is really critical, and this is new to the 2015 guidelines, is that we want to consume less than 10% of our calories per day from added sugars. We'll talk about that when we look at the labels. We want to consume less than 10% of the calories per day from saturated fats and less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium. If alcohol is consumed, that's fine, but it should be in moderation. 1 drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men, and again, only adults that are legally able to drink. So a healthy eating pattern, the guiding principle is that this is an eating pattern that represents the totality of all foods and beverages consumed. We'll talk about specific diets a little bit later in the lecture. Nutritional needs need to be met primarily from foods. If I could highlight that and circle it right now, I would, is that we really want to be thinking about how nutrient dense can we make people's diets so that they're getting their needs met from food. and that healthy eating patterns are adaptable. I call this being on the spectrum. So for some people, eating a slightly higher carbohydrate diet is going to work. For some people, eating a slightly higher fat diet is going to work better. But as long as it's from that healthy eating spectrum coming from real food, you're hitting the mark. So when we look at the history of the dietary guidelines, and you'll hear often today, particularly in pop culture, that the dietary guidelines have been sort of wishy-washy all over the place. It's actually not true, and you'll see that in the next few slides. The dietary guidelines were first released in 1980. They're updated every 5 years, and we look to the federal government to initiate a project that's going to be a collaboration between Health and Human Services and the USDA to work with scientists in the field in order to create a policy document. I think it's a really neat intersection, actually, one of the few intersections, mandatory intersections, of science and policy. And it's always really interesting to see the difference between what the scientists say and what the policy document actually ends up coming out to be. I'm just going to flip through the next couple of slides fairly quickly, but I want you to see that starting in 1980, we started with about the same guidelines that we have now. So we want to eat a variety of foods, we want to maintain an ideal weight, we want to avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. We want to eat foods with an adequate starch and fiber, avoiding too much sugar, avoiding too much sodium, and drinking in moderation. So you can see that in the last 40 years or so, we really haven't changed. And the science hasn't really changed. We're getting a little bit more intricate, and we're drilling down a little bit deeper where we know how some of these molecules react that are a little bit different than we thought maybe, or just learning more about them in general. But the overall guidelines to the population have stayed fairly steady. Again, they stay very similar, thinking about eating more starch and fiber a little bit more in the 80s, avoiding fat and saturated fat and cholesterol. And this is really where the policy, and you'll see in a little bit more, the food marketing started to sort of take a turn into low-fat diets. But the guidelines actually never said that. They said to avoid too much fat, and the sort of important part of this is avoid too much fat, right? Because we know that fat is an incredibly nutrient deficient and high-calorie food. Particularly if you're thinking about saturated fat. And, when you start going through in 1990, very similar, the language started to change a little bit, what eating more or eating less. And there's sort of semantics arguments in the nutrition world about how that affected behavior. But, the general guidelines stayed about the same. In 1995, we had some rings, which I think was a little bit of a nod to the 96 Olympics that were in Atlanta. This is also in 1995 where we introduced the food pyramid, so you probably were taught how to eat with the food pyramid when you were younger. People also argue that this was a problem, particularly with regard to the increased carbohydrate, thus increased sugar problem that we have now, is at the base of this pyramid was whole grains. They changed that 2000, things got a little bit weird with regard to the dietary guidelines and the way that they put them, but they did start to really think about making a healthy behavior overall, so building a healthy base and choosing food sensibly. 2005 was when we switched the pyramid, so now we don't have a base of grains. It's sort of the up and down version. The problem with this is that nobody knew how to use it, so even when you gave it to the kids in elementary school, they were like, what do all these stripes mean? I don't even understand. What's the green stripe for? How much am I supposed to have? So that was kind of a failed experiment. But the actual guidelines stayed about the same. In 2010, we started to think again about these expanding on these healthy eating patterns, so balancing calories, enjoying your food, but eating less, noticing that we were eating some pretty significant sized portions, wanting to making sure that we're avoiding that, making half your plates fruits and vegetables, switching to the low-fat milk, and just making sure that you're paying attention to your sodium and sugary drinks. Then we come up with the 2015 guidelines, and just so that you know how these come about, the 2015 guidelines were chaired by Dr. Alice Lichtenstein of Tufts University, and one of the members was also Miriam Nelson of Tufts University. There were 11 other experts in the subjects of energy balance, epidemiology, general medicine, nutritional biochemistry, food safety and technology, gerontology, pediatrics. maternal and gestational health, nutrition education, so that's really about behavior change, prevention of various chronic diseases, and actual statistics and review methodology. And so what they do is we call these the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and they conduct an analysis of all of the new scientific information that has been published from the last publishing of the dietary guidelines to now. They've got the USDA Nutrition Evidence Library to conduct systematic reviews of the research, and they use that to answer about 180 questions with regard to nutrition and health. They come up with a document that they send to USDA and HHS. USDA and HHS, with the help of all of their policy friends, lobbyists, other advisors, develop the policy, which becomes the dietary guidelines for Americans. The department also develops messages and materials like the pyramid, and you'll see in just a second we're now using a plate to give to us as practitioners to guide the general public. And it's really interesting because the dietary guidelines is actually a very open process. So you can go, and we put some links here for you. They're still all active hyperlinks, is that you can look at the public comments that individuals can go to the health.gov website and make comments. Right now, I believe they're accepting comments on certain labels that go on packaged foods. So you can go and see what they're accepting public comment for. And there is the scientific evidence that the committee gave to the USDA and HHS is available as well. So you can see exactly what the scientists said and the research that they used to inform their decision. And then lastly, you can see the dietary guidelines. It was interesting this year, one of the more controversial ones that actually pieces of evidence that the scientists sort of uncovered was the relationship between food and eating and the environment. And the scientific committee wanted the dietary guidelines to include some kind of information about that connection, and that actually got squashed in Washington, and they didn't end up including it, which was a bit of a controversy and actually held up the 2015 dietary guidelines until being released in 2016. And so if you look at the dietary guidelines, a lot of this is really based on what we're eating now, and you can look at that. So you can look at the intake below the recommended level or intake at or above the recommended level, and it's pretty clear that we're not doing a very good job of following these guidelines. And this really hasn't changed much at all. So we know that the general population is eating an intake below the recommended guideline in vegetables, fruits, dairy, and oils. And we're about even on total grains, but that doesn't include, that includes both refined grains and whole grains. If you were to break that down by whole grains and refined grains, the whole grains would be pretty orange. We are eating plenty of added sugars, saturated fats, and sodium are at or above the recommended level. We like to use this picture a lot because this was from a book that is called Hungry Planet, and it's pictures from around the world of what families tend to eat. And so this author went and found sort of the average family in several different countries and asked them to essentially go grocery shopping for what they do and take a picture of what they eat throughout the week. And so you can see the tremendous amount of processed and packaged foods that we tend to eat, and I've got some data on that a little bit later in the lecture. You can see the fruits and vegetables that are in there too, for sure, but there's just a significant amount of packaged foods, meat products, and these sort of high-fat, high-salt, high sugar-laden foods that we just tend to gravitate to. The most recent tool that the dietary guidelines put out is called My Plate, which is a little bit easier to follow if you were to set up your plate. Fruits on the left, vegetables on the left. You want that to be half your plate. Whole grains there on the top right. Some protein, and then they recommend dairy as your drink. So the dietary guideline summary is that they're revised every 5 years. They provide advice for making food choices that promote good health, advocate healthy weight, and help prevent diseases based on the evidence that the scientific committee finds. They form the basis of federal nutrition policy, education outreach, and food assistance programs. And they've actually been remarkably consistent, as I mentioned, throughout the last 50 years, despite criticism. So thinking about some of these foods that we eat, many of which have a label on them, the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for assuring that foods sold in the United States are safe, wholesome, and properly labeled. And so when you look at a nutrition label, this is actually pretty important because your patients are probably going to be asking you about this, is that you want to start with your nutrition facts label at the top. And this is really important, is that you're going to see the servings per container. And oftentimes, even in somewhat deceiving moments, like for example, a bottle of Gatorade tends to be 1.5 or 2 servings, the whole bottle, and obviously somebody's going to drink that whole bottle of Gatorade if they have it. So it's really important to check the serving sizes. Check the calories. The calories, it's really important to note, are per serving. So in this case, the servings per container are 2, the calories are 250. So if you were to eat the entire box, this looks like for macaroni and cheese, you would be consuming 500 calories. So just make sure that you're multiplying the calories by the servings. In the top of the panel, you'll actually see, and this is not quite obvious on these labels because they're not colored, it's all white. The nutrients that are on the top are the nutrients that we want you to limit. So total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, and sodium get listed first, along with the percentage of their daily value. Total carbohydrates are next, dietary fiber, and you'll see this added sugars is on the new label, and then protein. And then the nutrients of concern, which means these are the nutrients that we're not getting enough of, are labeled on the bottom. So vitamin A, C, calcium, and iron are on every label because we want people to increase the intake of these foods. You'll see often the front of the pack, facts up front label. The USDA and FDA spoke about making these mandatory, and so the food industry tried to sort of get ahead of it so that they didn't have to put things on it that they didn't want to. This never actually became a law, but the front of the pack labels look something like this if you see them. So again, this is the nutrition facts label. It's important to know that 20% or more of anything, so be it the nutrients that we're concerned about for too much or the nutrients of concern that are too little, 20% or more is a high serving. So in this case, calcium is high and sodium is high. 5% or less is low. So this would be a low iron, low vitamin C, and low vitamin A food. Again, serving size, making sure that you're paying attention to the serving size, particularly how many servings there are in the food package. I like to always pick on Ben & Jerry's. That little teeny tiny pint has only 4 servings. So if you ate it, you should sit through it in 4 different seatings, which is pretty hard to do because it's a small container. Again, this is I think it's a vitamin water. So this is a general vitamin water. This is 8 fluid ounces. There are 2.5 servings of 8 fluid ounces in this container of vitamin water. Obviously, you buy it so that you can drink the whole thing. You just need to be careful. Again, calories are going to provide a measure of how much energy you get from a serving of food, and that the number of servings you consume determines the number of calories you actually eat. Again, the nutrients, the limit nutrients are on the top. The get enough of these nutrients are on the bottom. So A, C, calcium, and iron, total fat, sodium, dietary fiber, and sugar. These are all based on your percent daily value, which are based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which is the average calories to maintain weight in the general population. This does not take into consideration body size or activity. This is just a general rule of thumb that's put on all nutrition facts panels. Ingredients are the next thing to pay attention to. So these are listed in order, in descending order of waste. So when you look at this is a bottle of ketchup. Tomato concentrate is the highest weight ingredient from red ripe tomatoes. Then we've got high fructose corn syrup in the ingredients, corn syrup, salt, spice, onion powder, and natural flavoring. This is an interesting one. So when you look at, these are an example of Apple Jacks, which tout that and they've got a big label on it that they're made with 9 grams of whole grains, which is great, except the number 1 ingredient on Apple Jacks is sugar. So you need to be really careful, as opposed to shredded wheat, when you look at the number one ingredient and the only ingredient is whole grain wheat. So you really want to pay attention to these ingredient labels because they can tell you a lot with regard to what the claims on the front of the box actually are making. I get this one a lot is, should you not buy food that if you can't pronounce the ingredients? And the answer to that is probably it doesn't matter. I always use this as an example. So if you think about some of these chemical names that we learn in the academic and the medical space that the general population just doesn't really know. So dihydrogen oxide obviously is water. Cyanocobalamin, ascorbic acid, alpha tocopherol, phylloquinone, and pyridoxine are all vitamins. So you've got B there, C, E, K, and another B vitamin. So if you were to, and I love this example of all of the things that are in a banana that sound so scary, but really it's just naturally occurring sugars, proteins, fats, and flavors. So you just be careful with that one. Coming soon, so this is a new label. You'll notice that the serving size is very bold. The calories are very large, so that hopefully stands out to people. We've also got an added sugars column here, which is really important. And we're going to start declaring the actual amounts of these nutrients. So you'll see there next to vitamin D, you'll have 2 micrograms, and the nutrients are changing. So these are based on the nutrients of concerns from the new dietary guidelines. So you'll see vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium are the new nutrients that will be displayed on every label. Packaged foods can make some claims, as we mentioned just a second ago, that whole grains, 8 grams of whole grains label on the front, but they are limited into what they can say. However, these marketers get really clever wiggling around these 3 claims. So you'll see a health claim. This is going to describe a relationship between a food component, or a dietary supplement ingredient and reducing the risk of a disease. We have something called a nutrient content claim that's going to describe the relative amount of the nutrient or dietary supplement or substance in a product. So that was that high or low that we were just talking about. And then a structure function claim describes how a product may affect the organs or systems of the body, but can't really mention a disease. So for example, Cheerios is really great, as are most cereals, of sort of manipulating these labels. Cheerios says that it's going to lower your cholesterol. We saw the mechanism through the fiber and the cholesterol because Cheerios is high in fiber. These are reviewed and approved by the FDA. There are currently, and actually this has been updated, there are 18 health claims that are able to be used in the U.S. They're disease specific, and only some foods are allowed. So you have to have a certain amount of the nutrient. For example, in Cheerios, they have to have a certain amount of fiber to claim that it's going to lower your cholesterol. The nutrient content claims are these claims that you've seen that are a good or high source of a certain nutrient. So this is a Rice Krispie Treats, which we know is probably not that great for you, does happen to be a good source of vitamin D. Structure function claim, and I used Activia because they actually got in a little bit of trouble with this. They say this is a structure function that Activia helps regulate your digestive system. So this Bifidus regularis is one of the probiotics that are in your gut microbiome. And you just have to be a little bit careful with this because these are the ones that tend to make some pretty reachy claims with regard to what they're actually doing in your body. And the general population tends to fall for it pretty hard, even if it's not really doing something clinically. Again, another example is Cocoa Krispies, because they've got 25% of your antioxidants and nutrients, particularly vitamins A, B, C, and E. It's been fortified. Cocoa Krispies now supports your child's immunity. A little bit questionable there. The organic label is one that you will also see. It's overseen by the USDA, not the FDA. There are fixed standards on what can be called organic or not organic. They can't use organic. They can't use pesticides, but they may use organic pesticides. This is actually a pretty serious misunderstanding in the general population, is that many people think that organic means that there are no pesticides. That's not true. They're actually organic pesticides that are allowed to be used. So when you go and you buy your organic strawberries and they're this big and they're beautiful and lovely, it's not because they haven't been touched by a pesticide. It's probably because they've been using a metal, like copper-based pesticide, which is approved organic. They may not, however, be a GMO product. Natural label, this is one that the FDA was, this is overseen by the FDA, and they were accepting public comments about natural a couple months ago. Natural doesn't really mean anything. It refers to content, but not necessarily processing. So there is no definition of the term natural, which is why you'll see things like all natural Cheetos. It's a processed food. It doesn't really mean anything. And until it's regulated, I think the food companies will just continue to use it. The thing is with many of these labels is that we're finding with people is that there are a lot of personal connections and personal beliefs with regard to many of these labels. Not many of them are actually based in scientific evidence, and so we need to be really careful about a lot of these labels because the marketing companies from these or marketing agencies for these companies are really using these labels to provide somewhat of a halo effect to a lot of this processed food so that we're tempted to buy it. All right, so now we've gone through the macronutrients, the micronutrients, the dietary guidelines, and why and how food is labeled. Now the question is, okay, what should people eat? What diet is actually optimal? So I'm a scientist, so let's go to the data. So you've got a low-fat diet. This is called the DASH diet. This is the diet that was developed by the NHLBI to attack hypertension. And so a DASH-like diet, and these numbers I just love so much. A DASH-like diet, this is a low-fat diet, can significantly protect against cardiovascular disease, particularly coronary heart disease, stroke, and heart failure risk by 20, 21, 19, and 29% overall, respectively. So when we're thinking about this, guys, if we're looking at this big meta-analysis that was released in 2013, this low-fat diet is really strong. So 29% risk reduction, relative risk reduction of these cardiovascular diseases that we know to be so prevalent just by following a low-fat diet. We also know, interestingly, that low-carb, high-protein works. So higher protein diets are often associated with lower BMIs, increased satiety. We know that they aid in muscle recovery, immune health, satiety, that fullness effect, decreased muscle loss with aging, and we know, as we mentioned earlier, they can be sourced from animal and plant foods. So these tend to be highly regarded diets, low-carb, high-protein. Now we're on to, this is the new thing, is that we're on to a high-fat diet. So the dietary intake of saturated fat, as we're finding more and more, is not associated with increased risk of coronary events. There is some, so the sort of moral of the story is the more fat you eat is not necessarily associated with increased risk of coronary events. The sort of counter argument to this, and just to, it's important to think about, is it's not necessarily associated with increased risk, but it's not showing to be beneficial either. And we know the general population to be at pretty high risk for coronary artery disease anyways, and coronary heart disease. So the sort of claim that a high-fat diet isn't associated with increased risk of coronary events is not really a huge gold star on the forehead of the high-fat diet. But, and I've been waiting for this study to come out for a really long time. I was pretty excited about this. A high-fat diet was released out of a group in Norway about 3-4 months ago. And I love this. This is the Daily Mail. They're sort of the pervasive headline screamers in the nutrition world. And so they said, saturated fat is good for you, a study claims, but only after a Tufts University study made headlines saying butter is harmless. Days later, a Harvard University study released a study saying it raises the risk of death. Last month, Tufts released a new study saying butter is the best avoided. Now, a new Norwegian study has found a diet rich in saturated fat was the only way to boost good cholesterol levels in patients with abdominal obesity. And this was the picture that was associated with this headline. So basically the headline is saying, now fat is back. Saturated fat is the only way that you can boost good cholesterol. And then they pair it with a picture that is a cheeseburger and French fries. Now this is the problem with these headlines, is that when you actually went back and looked and asked the researchers what they said, they looked at the effects of total unsaturated fat, and this is really important, in the context of a healthy diet rich in fresh, lowly processed, and nutritious foods, including high amounts of vegetables and rice instead of flour-based products. So this was a high saturated diet, but it was coming from really good food, particularly the fat sources were low processed, mostly butter, cream, and cold pressed oils, and they were surrounded by lots of vegetables and low flour products. The researchers went on to say that our findings indicate that the overriding principle of a healthy diet is not the quantity of fat or carbohydrates, but the quality of food that we eat. And so I put the data there for you so you can compare the diets. And so then you say, well, yeah, that's great, but what about weight? Isn't there a better diet for weight loss or another? And actually this study, this comes from the New England Journal, but there's been many studies that have been done comparing high protein to low protein, high fat to low carbohydrate diets. And this was just one of the examples where we're looking at waist circumference and change in weight. And we found that there's actually no difference. And if you go on a diet, everybody actually does all right. So any type of diet, and I love this is from one of the researchers, taught for the purpose of weight loss with enthusiasm and persistence. And that's where you come in as physicians and the team around you of dietitians and health coaches and chefs when you talk to Ronnie. The enthusiasm and persistence is really the important part, not so much the macronutrient components. This is another example that I like to show, particularly physicians, because it compares lifestyle to metformin. You probably have seen this study. I think you should take this slide and put it in every single presentation you ever make, is that we know that the risk reduction of increased incidence of diabetes from pre-diabetes, if put on metformin, you can reduce that risk of developing type 2 diabetes by 33%. Go metformin, seems to be working, that's great, but you can reduce it by almost 60% with a lifestyle intervention. So this is good, healthy food, a little bit of exercise, and behavior change. And not only are we decreasing cumulative incidence of diabetes by 60%, we're saving about $5,000 per additional year of life for these people that did not develop diabetes. So this is a critical, not only quality of life issue, but it's also a critical component of this healthcare cost issue that we are continuously talking about. The problem is that this is not what Americans are eating. 60% of the American diet comes from ultra-processed foods, and that's the average. So when you're looking at it, if we break down into quintiles of dietary share of ultra-processed foods, in the lowest quintile, the average is still 32% of the food that we eat is ultra-processed. The highest quintile is 81%. So we're talking about a lot of ultra-processed foods that are on our plates. If you flip that around, the unprocessed or the minimally processed foods in the highest quintile, so the people that are eating the most, are still only getting about 50% of their food from unprocessed sources. The highest quintile is getting only about 13% of their diet from unprocessed foods. And I'm just going to read this out to you because I just think it's so important. Meat, fruit, milk, grains, roots and tubers, eggs, pasta, legumes, fish, seafood, vegetables, and other processed foods and culinary ingredients. I mean, there's something to be said for what else is there. And whatever else is out there makes up approximately 60% of our diet. So it's really important that we come back to this idea of real food. We know that the ultra-processed food leads to increases in calories, decreases in protein, increases in carbohydrates, particularly added sugar, increases in saturated fat, decreases in fiber, and decreased micronutrients. Okay, but this is the part where we get real. What should people actually be eating? This is a visual exercise right here. I'm going to lead you through it. This is a low-fat diet. So you're looking at it. So we've got a nice salad here, little bit of egg. You could even scoop out that egg yolk if we wanted to make it a little bit lower in fat, but it's not a low carbohydrate diet, so you've got a little bit of bread there on the other side. This is a low carb diet. So you can see that we've removed the bread. Perhaps we've added a little bit of wine in here. Maybe there's a little Mediterranean flair. You've added a little bit more protein. This is a high protein diet, so now you can see that there's a significant amount of protein. You've added some quinoa because a little extra protein. This is a high fat diet, so this has got a nice fatty piece of salmon with an avocado. I'm going to go through that again. This is the high fat diet. This is the high protein diet. This is the low carb diet. This is the low fat diet. Let's do it one more time. Low fat diet, low carb diet, high protein diet, high fat diet. Are you noticing something? Yeah, they're all the same, right? So we need to make sure that we're really focusing on changing nutrition behavior around food by understanding the changing disease and diet landscape in America. 60% of the food that we are eating is highly processed food. We need to discover strategies to implement mindful eating behaviors, and you're going to work on this if you haven't already with Dr. Pollack and his chef coaching model. Thinking about the eating environment, the ambient factors that influence food choices but are independent of the food itself. So the atmosphere in which you eat food, the effort of obtaining food, and this is a lecture all in of itself. The time of day you eat, the social interactions, the distractions that you have can all inform the types of food that you eat, but that if we create an eating environment that's surrounded around eating real food, we can really move the needle on this. And then lastly, we know food preparation and cooking, which you'll be working on with Dr. Pollack, to compare several cooking preparations on nutrient quality, understanding cooking trends, and examining the effects of cooking on health for individuals, families, and yourself. That's part of the health coaching model that you'll be taking part in with Dr. Pollack. So this is your final take home, and please use this. You can Google it if you can't get it off these slides. I love it. Is the idea here is to choose real food. If you look at the dietary guidelines, if you look at the nutrient density of food, the best place, the most healthy place that we can get food and nutrients and health for ourselves and our patients is through real food. So I like to leave this off. Don't eat processed crap, and juice and soda are sugar. So if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to email me or to email Mary, and we would love to hear from you, and we'll see you soon. Good luck on the rest of your rotation.